Good evening. I'm David Aronovich. I'm a presenter with the BBC. I present the BBC's Radio 4 programme, The Briefing Room, and I also write for a living. Most recently, I write a Substack, as I'm sure most of you do too. That's what I do, and that's enough about me. We're here to listen to Anne Applebaum, who's on my right, who I haven't seen since we were at Mount Stewart in Northern Ireland, Mount Stewart House, a wonderful National Trust house, which used to do events, and I hope will one day again.
I'd forgotten that meeting, yes.
You see, I'm forgettable, you're not.
No, I've forgotten Mount Stewart House, not you.
Anyway, it has wonderful gardens. Anne's one of my favourite writers of factual matters. In fact, I would think that she's one of the people who, when I think I'm going mad, convinces me that actually it's them who's mad and it's us that's sane. My first of Anne's books that I ever bought was Gulag, which was, as she was explaining upstairs, partially a product of a lifetime's desire to try, which she got very early on, to try and explain the Soviet Union and societies like it ever since she was first there. We may talk a little bit about that later. So it's gone through, since Gulag, it's gone through a number of iterations, if you like, of Anne's deep interest in Eastern Europe. And I think much broader, actually, than just Eastern Europe. It's broadened out as we have seen a kind of series of radicalizations and authoritarian advances which weren't what we expected to see in the wake of the fall of the wall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So she's become one of, not just an analyst of it, but she's actually a rather good polemicist about it. Now, I like polemicists if I can trust their analysis and so on. I don't see anything wrong with that. And Anne is a polemicist whose analysis I can trust, just as I can trust her histories. Now, her latest book is this one here, and she has signed about 1 million copies and so on, and they're at the back. Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. And I'm going to talk to Anne about that for about 40 minutes. There's a lot that she has to say and one or two questions that I want to put. And then after that, there will be at least 20 minutes when people can put questions from the floor. And that will be the chance for people to, as I said, ask questions. Major speeches, not welcomed. We were having a little chat upstairs about questions that we find difficult, like, what about India? Or something of that kind, or you know.
What are we going to do about China?
Very big question, very big question. We might, if that's us, we might have to split it down. But Anne, let's talk about. Anyway, maybe a little round of applause to welcome Anne would be appropriate.
And thank you, David.
By the way, I've always thought that stools like this are discriminatory against older men. I am very precarious here. I just want you to know that so you appreciate what I'm doing for you here this evening. And let's talk about the book. The book starts in a very kind of particular place and not really where I would have expected. It starts in Venezuela. And it starts in Venezuela because you are analysing a particular phenomenon and how it's organised. I'd like you to tell us about it and explain what it is that regime brought together.
So first of all, thank you to one of my favorite journalists for agreeing to do this. Thank you all for coming on a weeknight.
You can skip the bit about favorite journalists.
Favorite journalists. I can say that again. Thank you for coming on a school night, I suppose, is the right way to put it. In a way, actually, it's appropriate that the book starts in Venezuela because actually my understanding of the phenomenon that the book describes, in a way, began in Venezuela. I was there in February of 2020, about 2 weeks before the pandemic, although I didn't know that. And had met a range of people there and snuck in and snuck out on my Polish passport and had a good look at Caracas. And Venezuela is an extraordinary story because it's a country that has been slowly on the road to becoming a failed state for a long time. Its leadership, it was the richest country in South America. It is now the poorest. It produces, by some counts, more refugees than Ukraine. Although it's an oil-rich state, it has malnutrition. It even has people who have no access to electricity, which was not the case 20 years ago, so it's been through this precipitous decline. It's a state also that was a democracy and was taken over by an autocratic populist party of the left, who slowly dismantled democratic institutions. And it's also, the regime is very unpopular. It was originally Hugo Chavez, now it's led by Nicolas Maduro. It's very unpopular, it's an economic failure. It's one, as I said, it exports people around the region. And the question is, why does it survive? And one of the reasons it survives, one of the very important reasons it survives, despite, I should also add, a very well-organized, very thoughtful, very energetic and active opposition movement, which has had different leaders, the current one is a very, very talented woman. Nevertheless, it survives. One of the reasons it survives, maybe the main reason, is that it has the support of a network of autocratic states, of other states, some of with whom it has nothing in common historically or geographically or culturally or any other way. So the network is a group of states that have no ideological links. Nevertheless, they all saw some purpose in helping the Venezuelan regime survive. So one of them is Russia, which has sold weapons to Venezuela, probably assists the Venezuelan regime in hiding, it's stealing and hiding money, it has connections to international crime. China has sold Venezuela surveillance technology. The Chinese have also made these big investments into Venezuelan state companies. There's a very famous investment into a railway. Most of the money disappeared and the railway was never built. And apparently even the Chinese were very shocked by the scale of corruption. Like they thought there would be kickbacks, but not that actually there would never be a railway. But that was more or less what happened. They have also support from Cuba. Cuba sends secret police advisors to Venezuela and has done for a long time. I was told last week, I can't prove it since I'm not there, but I was told that there are many there now who are helping the Venezuelan army protect its weapons. There's a lot of unrest there at the moment. As you know, there was just an election which the regime lost and yet doesn't want to hand over power. And then there's the relationship with Iran. And this to me is the strangest one because really, I mean, the Venezuelan regime is a left-wing socialist regime, ostensibly. The Iranian regime is a Islamic theocracy. They have nothing to do with one another historically or culturally or geographically at all, and yet they have a deep relationship which is based on the avoidance of sanctions. The Iranians help the Venezuelans avoid sanctions and they give them access to their networks. In return, the Venezuelans allegedly offer visas to Hezbollah. They help the Venezuelans move around, the Iranian proxies move around Europe. So in essence, a kind of network emerged around Venezuela that keeps this regime alive. And it was really through understanding that I came to understand that there is this network. It does not share an ideology. It is a network of both individual leaders and in some cases political parties who see themselves as deserving to rule without any checks and balances at all. So there is no independent judiciary. There is no independent media. They control the information system in their countries. There is no legitimate opposition, no real opposition. Sometimes there's fake opposition, but there's no legitimate opposition. They would like to continue ruling that way. They would like to rule that way with no transparency, no accountability, no ombudsman, no ethics rules. And they share that kind of absolute power, that desire for absolute power. They share some kinds of technology. They learn from one another. They have similar, they watch how one another, they learn tactics of repression from one another. And they really have only really one area of full agreement, and the area of full agreement is that they don't like us. They don't like the language of liberal democracy. They don't like exactly the language of the rule of law, of rights, human rights, of transparency, of accountability, because those are the things that would hamper their particular vision of power. And they, of course, that's the language often used by their own opposition or their own dissident movements or their activists, as the case may be. And so they dislike it when they hear it from them, and also increasingly they dislike it when they hear it from us, and they seek to undermine that language and the rules that are built into the international political system, the international legal system, in order to dismantle it. And so they work together in Venezuela. You can see them operating together in other places. In fact, once you are aware that this network is there, it becomes very hard to unsee it. So I find almost every day there's some news story in which I notice again that there was a Russian-Chinese aviation exercise a few days ago. They're almost daily. There's some piece of news that reflects the activity of this network. To be clear, it's not a conspiracy. It's not secret. I mean, most of the material in my book is open. I mean, it's from investigative reporting done by various people, or it's open material. There isn't a secret room where dictators meet, like in a James Bond movie, that I think it's Spectre, where they sit around the table and they all have octopus rings, right? It's not like that. So it's not like that. A lot of it's open. I mean, I'm sure there are some secret deals around as well, or just private deals, but they as I said, they have this set of common interests and they work together. And what's playing out in Venezuela now, as I said, there was an election a few weeks ago. The opposition won, and not only that, the opposition can prove that it won. And yet Maduro is resisting giving up power, and one of the things that gives him confidence is, as I said, the support of various, whether it's Cuban or Russian or Chinese help. So that's the role of Venezuela. And actually, I have friends in the Venezuelan opposition, and they contribute. I mean, a lot of my thinking about this comes from them and from Russians and Belarusians and others who, really, if you want to understand the autocratic world, it's best to talk to the people who live in it and who have analyzed it and can explain it. And so a lot of the book is about them, or comes from them.
One of the things I was very struck by, coming on to the next bit of the book, was to bring it closer to home, was, if you like, what you might call the Putin delusion. And this is not about how they behave with each other, it's about how we have behaved with them in the past. And I think it would be interesting to go through how Germany's policy of Ostpolitik, the idea that you should have a rapprochement, some kind of rapprochement over the Cold War barriers, and that would be better for everybody, back before the fall of the wall, morphed into Nord Stream 2 and the dependency that Europe and other places began to have upon autocracies and the delusions they had about what those autocracies were.
Yeah, no, this is something even before I wrote this book, I started writing that piece of it because I got interested in the question of where did this come from. Those of you who some of you may know the history of the German-Russian relationship, and it actually begins in the 1970s when there was one original meeting with sort of West German, Austrian, businessmen met with, basically it was Soviet bureaucrats, from the Ministry of Gas, whatever it was. And they met in a Habsburg villa, and they began discussing how they could cooperate. And if you try to imagine how weird that was, this is there were still, Berlin was still divided, and there were still, American and Russian soldiers in Europe, and, yet they had this meeting about gas pipelines. And some of it was to do with changes in technology that made gas pipelines work better. I spent some time trying to understand that, but I will not bore you with that piece of the story. But essentially, the original pipeline project, which began in this era, in the 70s, was from the beginning a political project. And it came from the West German desire to have a kind of mutually valuable economic relationship with the Soviet Union. And there was a theory behind it. And the theory was, if we're economically linked, then we won't go to war. because of course then people were afraid of it. And actually, I'm trying to give credit to the Germans of that era. It was not illogical, because that was the experience of Europe after the war, which is that we built these economic links between one another, and we formalized them, and we created things like the European Union and other institutions, and we didn't go to war. And so there was this experience of that being successful. And so the West Germans thought, let's extend that further. And then later on, I mean, there were plenty of elements of greed and so on, and people made money out of it, and there was cheap gas for a long time. Relatively cheap gas came to Germany. It was part of how Germany became what it, the economic powerhouse that it did. But it also created from the beginning these moral and political dilemmas that nobody ever really resolved. So there was this gas flowed from Russia to Germany, and actually then to the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe, and it wasn't just the Germans who benefited, Austria, Italy, I think. So there was this benefit, and gas flowed there, and of course we paid for the gas. And then at the same time, the Soviet Union was funding in that era, terrorist operations in Europe, the Red Brigades, and so on. So we were paying the Soviet Union, which then funded terrorism that was designed to destabilize Europe, and nobody ever really grappled with that. I mean, it was just a thing that happened. I mean, there were a number of critics of the pipelines, including a lot of American presidents were always skeptical of them. Nixon hated it. He thought it was a plot to undermine American-German relationship and undermine NATO, and I think Jimmy Carter didn't like them either. I mean, but nevertheless, it survived, and it survived into the 90s. And in the 90s, this idea, because it hadn't really been refuted, became the basis of not just German, but Western American, the democratic world's policy towards the post-Soviet world, and then later towards China. The idea was that we would build economic links, and those would lead to political links, and then we wouldn't fight, and everybody would benefit. As the Chinese would say, it would be a win-win situation. And at a certain point, there even became an idea that was attached to that by doing this, we would also bring democracy to those countries, and that they would become liberal, and they would be friends with us. And it has to be said, to be fair again, that a lot of Russians thought that too, and wanted that to happen. And even there were Chinese who thought that, that if we it traded, that they wanted their countries also to liberalize. So it wasn't some insane idea. But clearly, over the next couple of decades, this failed. Instead, what it produced was a kind of a piece of the German business community that was very dependent on Russia, was very pro-Russian, fought against the idea insisted on maintaining normal economic relations with Russia, for example, even after the invasion of 2014. And even as, because of course the pipelines that were built in more recent years also had a political purpose. So the Nord Stream was a Russian project to build a pipeline across the Baltic Sea and thereby avoid Poland and Ukraine, with the aim eventually of cutting off Ukraine and maybe of invading Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, this was pointed out to the Germans, but they didn't want to believe it. They kept saying it's just a business project. In any case, I won't give you too much more detail. The point is that we created these ambiguous economic relationships. We were operating on this assumption that we could have purely economic, apolitical relationships with the autocratic world, that there would not be a strategic backlash, or it would not rebound on us or undermine us, and this proved to be wrong.
There were a couple of widespread beliefs. Yeah, no, I mean, the other part of the delusion was, I think, that the autocratic world was primarily rational in the sense that we believed rationality, or the West believed rationality to be, which was the more trade that you had, the better off their people would be, the happier they would be, even possibly within their autocracy.
Yeah, no, I mean, the assumption was that they want the same thing that we do, that they want people to be prosperous and everybody to get richer, and because they want that and we want that, we'll have a mutual interest. But not all autocrats want that. I mean, in some cases, there are things that are more important to them. I mean, so it is not important to Putin that Russians are prosperous, or even that they stay alive. I mean, he's very happy for a lot of them to die on the front line. He's not bothered by that. There was even an extraordinary television appearance by the woman who runs RT on Russian television that I saw a clip of in the last couple of days, where she says something like that, we Russians, we're okay with dying. You know, we're fine with it. You know, that's the difference between us and the West. We don't mind dying. I mean, to the extent, I don't know whether most Russians share that view, but and also, it's also very notable that she wasn't dying. So, you know, so
Al-Qaeda used to say much the same thing.
That's exactly. So, but the idea, you know, our idea was that everybody's rational, and therefore you can always talk to them. I guess Tony Blair used to talk like that. You know, if I could just sit down in a room with him and we would have a beer together, we would find but that's not always true. And particularly as some of these regimes became more extreme, or their leaders became more worried about their own power, as happened in Russia, or they became more anxious about the impact that liberal ideas could have on their people. They became less interested in trade just for trade's sake, and they began looking for other things.
Although I think there's a pretty widespread belief that is still a significant motive for, let's say, China.
Yeah,
but in other words, Xi is interested.
There are big differences between these countries. You know, I'm not making any argument that says they're all the same. It's very different. And yes, you probably are right in China. I mean, I think the Chinese Communist Party, to some extent, it thinks that its legitimacy is it matters. Its legitimacy is derived in some way from the prosperity of people, and you know there could be discontent if it was. So yeah, I think they do care.
Okay. So this delusion in the West meets another, also has a kind of pragmatic and slightly corrupting element in the West as well. And you come into this in the last chapter of the book, and it was also the subject of a piece that you wrote in the Financial Times this last weekend, which is essentially that these autocracies are partially kept going by feeding vast amounts of money to their own ruling elites. And the practices of those ruling elites, which are partially political as well, have been immensely enabled by our own structures of finance and financial dealing in the West. It'd be very interesting, I think, to talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, one of the odd things about our economy, we actually have, in many ways, very highly regulated financial systems. I mean, if you run a pension fund, you have to comply with all kinds of rules and regulations. You know, you have to meet inspectors, and you have to meet the law. At the same time, we have also allowed to exist kind of side by side with the regular economy where people obey the rules and pay taxes. There is another economy where people operate through anonymous companies or trusts, where people have been, at least until recently, allowed to buy property anonymously. I think everybody who lives in London knows this phenomenon. You know, why is there are whole sections of central London that are owned by anonymous companies and who treat London flats or houses as secret stores of value. You know, you can own a house and not have your name on it and just use it as almost like an old-fashioned Swiss bank account. And that's not something that exists because it's a natural way that things work. There are regulations and laws that made that possible. And so it's one of the ways in which the people from the autocratic world hide their money or keep their money here, protected by our rule of law, in fact. We've also enabled means of transferring money around the world. We've allowed people to, you can essentially steal or take money out of, whether it's out of Russia or out of Angola, you can move it around the world, you can move it through the London financial markets, and you can keep it in various places, bring it back in different ways. And this is a system that has made a lot of even places that are sort of traditionally corrupt, you know, in a kind of low-level way, much more sophisticated. In the book, I write a little bit about Zimbabwe, which is partly just because I have a friend who's Zimbabwean, and he also, once again, explained some of this to me, and partly because it's such a good, certainly when people, there's some Westerners, some Europeans who have a fantasy about, you know, the autocratic world works so well and it's so much more efficient to have one leader. I mean, Zimbabwe is, you can always say, well, how about Zimbabwe, which is another almost failed state. And the leaders of Zimbabwe have taken advantage of the international financial markets and money laundering and so on to be able to move money out in a way that wouldn't have been possible 2 or 3 decades ago. And so part of the book is an argument about explanation of how that works. Not in as much detail. There are a lot of really great pieces of investigative journalism that really explain how it works. You know, Oliver Bullock or Tom Burgess. And part of the book is also an argument that asks, why do we let that happen? And why, and an argument that part of fighting autocracy is fighting not so much individual countries, but fighting autocratic practices. And among those practices are the secrecy around money. One of the features of the autocratic world is that you don't know why people have money. You don't know how they got it. You don't know how much it is. You don't know where it comes from. You know very little about rulers or people in power. And to the extent that we have secrecy in our world, it's that kind of secret. I mean, everybody has privacy. That's something different. To the extent that there's secrecy about in our world, that's something that we imported from the autocratic world. So one of the other arguments of the book is that globalization, again, we had this idea of, I don't know, we used to talk about West moving to East and, you know, democracy flowing from Europe, I don't know, to Eurasia. It's in retrospect equally true that in fact, what globalization was neutral. It just meant that ideas flowed in both directions, and some autocratic ideas flowed in our direction too.
You anticipated my next question, which is that if you are a Trump supporter, let's say, of goodwill, you might very well say, well, okay, but what does this matter to us? What's this got to do with us? If they don't actually interfere too much with us, what does it matter that all these places are autocratic? What does it matter even that they're run by kleptocrats? It's up to them to deal with that. But you then just said the ideas can flow the other way, even if they're unattractive. So let's explore that a bit.
So you think they're unattractive.
But
not everybody finds them unattractive.
Go on.
No, so there is, and this is a more recent phenomenon. I mean, this was originally Russian, but now there are others who joined in. One of the conclusions that the Russians came to was that undermining the idea of democracy, just doing it at home inside Russia, which, by the way, was a huge program. I mean, there was a wonderful study, I think it was Estonian, if I'm remembering correctly, of Russian television, and they surveyed, they watched, you know, every Russian television program about Europe for a month or two. And then they came up with the themes, and it was literally all about degeneracy. And if you walk down the street in Europe, you'll be murdered by an immigrant. And so they seek to undermine the idea of democracy in Europe, but they also realize that it would be very useful to undermine the idea of democracy here too. And so they did begin to run information campaigns, some very silly and ineffective, some rather more effective. And presenting, in essence, are seeking to craft and build an autocratic narrative that would appeal here. And the narrative, more or less, you all know, it's that autocracy is safe and stable, and democracy is divided and weak. You know, autocracy protects traditional values, and democracy is sexually degenerate. And those ideas, some of which came from here. I mean, it's not as if you had to import those ideas from Russia. I mean, there are plenty here. But their idea was to amplify them. And not only that, actually, I mean, they also seek to amplify extremism of different kinds, of the far left or the far right. You know, there's a weird Russian involvement with Catalan separatism, which I describe a little bit in the book. I mean, anything that can divide Europe, anything that can divide NATO, anything that can internally create conflict inside democratic states interests them. you know, and so, as I said, some of it's not serious. They don't invent things. I mean, you know, the Russians did not invent Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen's been in French politics for decades. Her father was in French politics for decades before that. You know, he has links to Vichy, which is even older than that. But they can amplify her, or they could give her some money, as they did for one election campaign. Or they could, you know, her MEPs, they could invite them to Crimea to, you know, to be election observers. I mean, there's a, you know, they would seek to amplify, protect, help those kinds of movements because they think it's beneficial to them. And so they began to interview. So you could look at both political interference, you could look at financial and economic interference, you could look at, you know, some of which is open and above board. I mean, I'm not saying all this is illegal. And you see the ways in which they seek to shape our world. I mean, and that's before even we've talked about Chinese strategic investments in telecoms, in ports, in other pieces of infrastructure that, if they ever wanted to, could be used to weaken us if that was in their interests. They might have not decided that yet. And so in the book, I'm not asking for a new Cold War. I'm not asking for, you know, Reds under the bed hysteria, just an awareness that this is what they do, and this is and understanding how it works helps explain things about our own society.
I think you slightly undersell yourself, because in the final section of the book, there's a whole lot about what we should do about it. So I actually ask every time I meet somebody. I did this last night and somebody I was sitting next to at dinner. I asked, so give me the positive argument for anonymous companies? Like, why should they exist? And really some people say, well, there's some celebrities who don't want you to know they own this particular house. And it just doesn't seem to me that a massive billion-dollar financial system should exist just for that reason. But I find very little real justification. And obviously some people want to dodge taxes. But I didn't see why that's legitimate. I can't dodge taxes. Also, the idea that celebrities want to be anonymous is really quite interesting. I mean, you know, you're likely to know if the place next door to you is bought and lived in by Elton John. It seems to me, but obviously, I mean, however, if you're if you're a mafiosi, that might be slightly different. It struck me while you were speaking there. Well, firstly, there was one moment in the book which I thought was, I kind of clocked it at the time, but I thought it was wonderfully revealing, which is the February 2022 meeting between Xi and Putin, and this is 18 days before the Russian invasion and full invasion of Ukraine, when they issue a joint statement condemning intervention in foreign countries by the West. They had a very particular view of what intervention meant and what it didn't mean.
No, they issued a statement. If I'm remembering correctly, it was either that one or a different one. They also talked about democracy. They talked about, you know, we have our own forms of democracy, and so we don't want to hear from you about democracy. There was an aspect of that as well. And they talked about, you know, the essence of the conversation was, or of the statement was, we don't have to listen to you and we don't accept your rules. And by that, remember what they mean is rules like don't invade your next door neighbors and occupy them and set up concentration camps on their territory. And Putin, by invading Ukraine, was demonstrating the degree to which he has contempt for all those rules. And by that, I mean, I don't mean, you know, some kind of, I'm not even talking about democracy. I'm talking about, you know, the language that has been used in Europe since the end of the Second World War of never again. You know, we won't allow mass murder in Europe to happen ever again. Well, the Russians are saying, yeah, actually, it's gonna happen. We're gonna kidnap children in Ukraine. We're gonna take them to Russia. We're gonna change their identities, and we dare you to try and do anything about it. Or we're going to set up these so-called filtration camps in occupied Ukraine, which are concentration camps, and we're going to torture people until they, you know, reveal whether they're Ukrainian, whatever in the Ukrainian army. And they are. This is part of an attempt to say we would like to be able to run the world differently, and by differently they mean without regard to human rights, without regard to the rights of smaller countries or to have sovereignty. They will decide who has sovereignty. I mean, Russia has a very particular idea about sovereignty. Only, they say we are sovereign, but Ukraine is not. And actually, they would say we are sovereign, but Germany is not. I mean, they have we get to decide what we think. Germany, because it's part of the alliance, the Americans tell them what to do. But they have a clear idea, and that's how they would like the world to be run. In a way, so that the international system functions like their system does at home, that there are no checks and balances, there's no blocks, there's no international institutions that stand in their way.
I'm being genuine when I say that I don't actually think that Donald Trump sees the world vastly differently to that, actually. And that the constraints upon him are the institutional constraints. They're not actually constraints in terms of attitude or policy that are very different from that. I do business with that person from my position of strength to that person's position of strength, and anything in between is of no account to me, and the rules are of no account.
Yeah, I mean, he says that more or less. I mean, I think that's the source. Famously, he periodically says how much he admires Xi Jinping or how much he admires the lead dictator of North Korea. And I think that's the source of his admiration. These are guys who get to rule with, they get to do whatever they want. There's no New York court stopping them and no New York Times investigating them. And, that's what he admires.
But in some countries, as you know, there used to be New York Timeses and New York courts stopping the government doing what they want, and they've gradually moved in on them. And I know that in this book, you're dealing with the actual autocracies themselves. But maybe we should just discuss a little bit some of the halfway stages that people have got to. I'm particularly interested in a place like Hungary, which acts essentially as an ally of Putin and Putin's main ally within Europe, but also employs people from this country and America to act as its mouthpieces here, actually pays them directly to do it. And somebody like Elon Musk, who has effectively become all the things internally that you've said that Russia wanted to do externally to the information systems within democracies.
I mean, so actually my previous book was partly about how and why people inside democracies are attracted to liberal ideas, and also how, this idea of how a democratically elected leader can take over or capture the state. Quite a lot nowadays when democracies end, it's usually not, there's some exceptions, but usually it's not like there's tanks in the street and there's like a lieutenant colonel who shoots up the presidential palace. I mean, normally you have elected leaders, legitimately elected leaders, like Viktor Orban or actually like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who come to power often using the language of so-called populism, saying, we represent the real people, we represent the true Hungarians. Our opponents are elites, foreigners, traitors, and therefore, when they win power, we then have the right to dismantle the democratic institutions. And that is what happened in Hungary. There was a systematic dismantling of the judiciary over several years. Actually, there's a brilliant article, believe it or not, by the publisher of the New York Times that was published today in the Washington Post, which was very delicate of him, in which he talks about how it was exactly that the Hungarians dismantled their press. It wasn't done through censorship because Hungary is a democracy. It was done instead through tax investigations, or predatory investors, or through, I saw there was a version of this that happened in Poland as well, threatening business people who advertised in independent media, for example. So it wasn't done, you didn't walk in with thugs and shut it down, you just used as I said, state institutions to harass independent media until it disappeared or changed hands. And that's the, and that's the process by which those things can happen. That idea that you could win an election and then dismantle the system so that you never lose an election again is very attractive to some politicians. That's it. Then you don't have to worry about running another election or losing an election. And of course, it also means that once you win, you have a certain degree of impunity because there aren't any courts who can investigate you, and then it's a lot easier to steal money if that's what you want to do, which I think Viktor Orban is interested in doing, very interested. I lived through a version of this, so some of you may know I lived part of the time in Poland, and we had a government in power for 8 years between 2015 and last October that unsuccessfully, and partly, well, they had some success, but they did have this same goal, and the goal was to dismantle the judiciary, to undermine media, to capture state institutions, and as it turned out, and of course it was all in the name of establishing traditional society and, promoting Polish patriotism, and actually in practice a lot of it was about money. I mean, it was, they set up foundations that were funded by the state, and then they put their cousins in charge of the foundations, and the cousins made enormous amounts of money. So anyway, it's more than you want to know. But those practices and those goals are alive and well. And one of the fears that people have about the Trump administration is that that's what it would do. And the attraction that people around Trump have for Orban, actually, is that. And what is it that they admire about him? They admire the fact that he was able to do this. Of course, Hungary is a very, very small country. You could try to do that in the United States. You might not succeed, but you could cause a lot of damage in the way.
This touches on an area of fascination. You indulge me for a moment on this, because some of you may have noticed in the last couple of days one of those kind of what used to be called Twitter but is now called X, or what do we call it? An X storm. In which the former main presenter for Fox News, Tucker Carlson, who was employed by my old employer, Rupert Murdoch, for a very long time at Fox News, and then was subsequently kicked out for a while, has now gone kind of independent, who is a huge supporter of Viktor Orban, and who is supposed to have had significant influence in helping to persuade Trump to pick J.D. Vance as his vice president on ideological grounds, essentially on the grounds of his position on abortion, women, families, church, religiosity, and so on. A bit like Law and Justice in Poland, that kind of prospectus. But in that interview with Darryl Cooper, they revisit history. And the quote that comes down floating through X from Tucker Carlson, as Darryl Cooper's a revisionist historian, is, if Churchill was so great, why 70 years later are English teenage girls begging for drugs on the streets of London? And then he goes on, and why is London no longer a majority English city? Why are the English a minority in their own city? This city, the city that we're sitting in right now. And this seems to me an absolutely constant theme of the kind of Orbanist, etc. And was a big theme also within the justifications for the riots that we saw at the beginning of August here, which is that somehow or other this isn't our country, it's been stolen, and it goes right back into history. The people we thought were our heroes were actually villains. And in the case of Churchill, why he's really villainous, but they don't quite want to say it, is because he fought against Hitler. You're a historian, as well as being somebody who looks at current societies. How seriously should we take emanations like that?
First of all, I should make clear that I'm glad Churchill fought Hitler. Thank you, England, for fighting Hitler. I really appreciate it. I think we should take it seriously. I mean, these attempts to reinterpret history, not attempts actually, these reinterpretations of history have a serious goal. And the goal is to question the legitimacy of our modern democracies, to loosen people's sense, their orientation change the sense of who we are, and maybe change our alliances, change the way we operate in the world. There's I suppose there's a fine line to be walked between, you don't want to amplify extremism and so on, but I think it's also important to take it seriously. It's funny, I was just, there's an argument Trump said in some speech he made. He said something about how I'm going to be a dictator for one day. oh, I'm just going to be a dictator for a day. And a lot of people said, well, that's Trump saying stupid things and he's making a joke and so on, and he wants all the liberals to be upset, so it doesn't mean anything. And maybe that's true. I mean, he says a lot of stuff. I don't know if this gets across the Atlantic. The stuff about sharks? He talks about sharks. Anyway.
And electric boats.
And electric boats, that's right. And anyway, never mind. So he says a lot of stuff. But on the other hand, I think it's important to take some of that language seriously, because it's also a way of preparing people to saying, well, it's not so bad to be a dictator, it's kind of a joke. Maybe, and then the same thing with an interview with somebody who wishes that Hitler had won the war. I mean, it's a way of saying, well, those ideas, they've been taboo for such a long time, maybe they weren't so bad. And it is a way of bringing them into the mainstream.
Yeah.
So I would take it seriously, yes.
And into the mainstream for current purposes. And let's talk a little bit more before we open this up about how you got into all this, because actually that history is interesting, and your publisher convinced me that it was interesting, and as soon as you started talking about it upstairs, I did find it very interesting, which takes us back to you being a student of Russian and deciding to go to Russia while it was still the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so I did study Russian at university. I did Russian in history and some other things. And I went to the Soviet Union in the summer of 1985, and I spent 3 months in Leningrad, when it was still Leningrad. And at that time, it really was like walking through the looking glass. It was a completely different society. It was very hard to understand. I did speak Russian. At one point I spoke it really well. It's gotten a little rusty since I can't go there anymore. But I met people there. I had the experience of asking somebody for directions on the street, and then they heard my foreign accent and ran away, because it was still a little bit weird to be a foreigner there. This is well before it opened up and so on. And I left, and a few years later it fell apart, and actually I was able to witness some of its falling apart. I then lived in Poland from the end of 1988 for several years, and I watched the collapse of the regime there, which was greeted with immense happiness and so on. I was also in Berlin just the sort of day after the wall fell. I drove with a person who then became my husband to watch that. So I saw the end of it. I saw it existing, and I saw how it ended, and then. In the years that followed, I started to wonder, well, if it was so obviously awful and stupid, which is what people felt by 1989, how did it come to be in the first place? Like, what was it? How did it work? And that produced first my book on the Gulag, which was an attempt to explain what was the concentration camp system, why did people work for it, how did it function?
How did you research for that? How did you research for that?
Well, that book, that was at a time when you could do research in Russia. So that was the research I did in the Russian archives. That was a 10-year project, which...
So they'd just really been opened.
They had opened the archives, and there was a period when they didn't exactly welcome foreign scholars, but they weren't bothered by them. I mean, it was almost, the attitude in the 90s was sort of some ridiculous American girl wants to read some old bits of paper, that's fine. It was there was no paranoia about it, which developed later again. And actually, the people who worked in the archives, with not all of them, but some of them were really happy that you were there. And so I actually had an archivist who I worked with a lot, who was probably the world's greatest expert on the Gulag. He worked with the Gulag papers and archives. He knew where everything was. I mean, he died a few years ago. I mean, he was a little weird, as you would be if you spent your life in the Gulag archive. He was also an alcoholic. So periodically I would go to Russia, and I would go to Moscow, and I would have an appointment with him, and he wouldn't show up, and then I would call him, and he would be slurring his voice on the phone. Actually, the first time it happened, I thought he was ill, and I had a friend of mine call him, and she laughed at me. She's like, he's not ill. Anyway, but he was really a wonderful person, and he helped me locate things. But I also traveled around the country, which was also possible then, and worked in archives in Karelia, which is where the White Sea Canal is, in Syktyvkar, which is in the Far East, I went to Vorkuta, I went to a lot of the sites of the camps, and I met, at that time, there were a lot of Russian historians working on the Gulag, and they had access to archives, and they'd written things. I mean, there was actually a little mini industry of people who did it and who knew about it. I expect it's mostly gone, and a lot of the archives that I worked in are now closed. I mean, you couldn't do it again. I mean, so in that little window, quite a lot of good things were written. There were a lot of really good books written at the time. You know, Catherine Merridale. I mean, there are a bunch of British historians who, Robert Service worked there, and did good work. But I think it's over for the moment. And that what happened when Putin came to power in the 2000s was he re-politicized history. So he kind of brought back the idea that history was something you used in politics. And then they became much more sensitive about who could use archives. And Anthony Beaver got kicked out of the military archives, and that happened. But I mean, in a way, maybe the more relevant to your question book is my second history book, which was about the Soviet conquest of Central Europe and how Central Europe was Sovietized, a book called Iron Curtain. And that was a book that tried to explain how it happened. And anyway, that's the... And, you know,
I strongly recommend this book, by the way.
And then, in a sense, you know, I've been sort of doing that ever since. And then when I saw some of these things come back, you know, I mean, I was just describing, when I watched the invasion of Crimea in 2014, my reaction was, oh, that's how they did it. You know, it was so exactly like what the Russians did in Eastern Poland, you know, in 1944, with sort of fake, you know, Russians in the wrong uniforms and getting local criminals to run stuff and making them the new leaders. You know, it was literally some of the same things they did. And so then when you begin, so I originally thought that I was writing books about the long distant past and things that would never happen again. And then I began to understand that some of it came back. And so a lot of my recent journalism is about that. That's it.
No, I was going to say, I very much recommend, I recommend most of Anne's books. The one I can't recommend is the one on cooking, because I didn't read it.
It's the best one.
It's the best one, isn't it? That's right. Nor the Anne Applebaum Guide to Central European Golfing. I haven't managed to get to.
I don't know how to play golf. No, I did write a cookbook. It's called From My Polish Country House Kitchen, and so it's out of print.
Anne's told me that the soups are very good, but the desserts don't work.
Don't make the cakes.
Okay. But when you were talking in Iron Curtain, you describe how essentially the domestic communists in these countries imported wholesale the Soviet security apparatus into them, and so on, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So that when I also saw what was happening, I was booked to appear on Question Time in the week that Russia essentially went into Crimea in 2014. And I found myself in the odd position of being the only person on the panel who, firstly, and please take this in the right way, seemed to know anything about it in historical terms, and secondly, was bothered by it. So Michael Heseltine was on the program and said, well, I don't think we should get our knickers in a twist about this. You know, Ukraine's crime has always been a bit of Russia, really. The Labour politician didn't like it, but really didn't know anything about it. And then there was a Russian journalist called Nekrasov on the program who was just vile. One of the vilest human beings I've ever come across.
I mean, I remember this period really. I was here then. I was living in London then. And I remember there were these endless programs. And I started to say, if there's a Russian journalist from Russian state media on whatever it is, the panel, I won't be on it. I stopped doing it because, you know, I'm not going to have an argument about, because they were arguing at that time that it's not an invasion, that this is a separatist movement that has arisen to take over Crimea. And as we know, you know, months later, Putin gave medals to all the soldiers who had been part of the invasion. But there was a point at which I wasn't going to go on TV and have an argument about what was happening. You know, I knew what was happening. I mean, we can argue about how to interpret or what to do about it, and that's fair. But not whether it's an invasion. I mean, it was an invasion. Anyway.
Yeah, the other thing that was fun in that respect was when the exchange recently happened of prisoners between Russia and the West. Some people in the West saw some people they thought had been their friends suddenly met by Putin at the airport.
There was one particular journalist, actually, who had lived in Poland for a while, so sort of Spanish, so-called Spanish journalist who was KGB, or whatever it is called, FSB.
Right, I think it's nearly time, in fact it probably is time to take some questions. Can I just say, yeah, there is a microphone, the microphone is over here, and you'll be choosing, not me, because I don't know the questions please, not great statements. If you have had huge experiences and lengthy experiences in these various countries, write your own book.
We'll start here.
And the publishers are here, so they will hear that you've got them, so you'll approach them afterwards. But we're here for questions. Thank you.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much to both of you. My name is Sophia. I've got a background in journalism. I was in Russia working for a US newspaper in 2004, 2006. My question is to you, Anne. Despite the fact that we knew what was going to happen, and I remember human rights activists warning us in 2003-04 where Putin is taking the country. But when you think about the Security Council meeting in February 2022, and how Putin had to really press them all against the wall, and people like Naryshkin and Patrushev didn't seem to really possibly like the idea.
The Russian Security Council, not the UN Security Council.
Well, of course, sorry, the Russian Security Council, February 22 with Putin, how he, it seemed, had to really press people against the wall and insist on invading Ukraine. Do you feel, were you surprised by it, how reluctant some of these people were who seemed to be in Putin's inner circle? Thank you.
You know, it's very hard to know how sincere are the facial expressions of members of the Russian Security Council when Putin is standing in front of them and they're being filmed. So I don't have any, I can't offer you any great insight. I don't know what they were really thinking. I do know that at the time, a lot of the Russian elite was genuinely surprised. Lavrov, for example, the Russian foreign minister, was surprised and had been denying it, you know, an hour earlier. And others were too, and they didn't expect it. They were then forced to come up with justifications for it, and it wasn't popular. Although, you know, you have to be careful. A lot of people always ask, well, is the war popular or not popular in Russia? I mean, remember that in Russia there is no public conversation. So talking about it's not like you could walk into a pub and have an argument about the war in Ukraine and you know, if you're against it, you could be arrested. So there is no popular conversation, and people aren't given an alternative. Like, you know, we could have it or we could not have it. They don't have any choices. So it's, but you know, it's one of the interesting questions in Russia is how long the elite, especially the security elite, will take the destruction of the army and so on. And I don't know the answer to that.
It does take you back a bit, though, doesn't it? I mean, this examination of faces to the old days of the Soviet Union, when you literally used to try and work out by the position of people on Lenin's mausoleum on Victory Day,
who was up and
who was up and who was down. And I remember as a young journalist on Weekend World being requested by the editor to make definite judgments about it from London. Not one of my less great moments. Yeah, please.
Hello. It was interesting to hear the parallels of politics with energy, whether it be oil from Venezuela, which you mentioned, and gas from Russia. How do you see the intersection of climate change and the global dependence on fossil fuel reducing over time? In connection to that, and with regards to China, we're increasingly dependent on China for products that enable a net zero transition. Should we be cognizant of the dependency issue?
You haven't quite said it, but you've come to one of the themes that I like a lot, which is that the climate change activists and the people who worry about autocracy and should be working together, because so many of the autocratic states are petrol states, fossil and fuel states. And that's not an accident, because if you have one huge natural resource and one small group of people control it, then it lends itself naturally. This is the huge exception being Norway. Maybe because they are maybe Scotland. You know,
No, I'm not sure about Scotland.
Seems to me that the people who oppose Putin and the people who want to do something about use of fossil fuels should be on the same team and working together, whatever that looks like in campaigning. I mean, on a broader level, I mean, I do think that, climate change. Well, no, let me answer it differently. Thinking about climate change is something that we should do with all the countries on the planet. So I'm not against discussing it with China or even discussing it with Russia. Although I think the Russians are in favor of climate change because it means the Arctic will melt, and they want that. So that I'm not. That's not a joke. That's true. So we should be working together with them, but we should also be, in the case of China, cautious about becoming over-dependent on them in exactly the technologies that you describe. Because if those become strategic technologies, whether it's electric car batteries or whether it's solar panels, then we could find ourselves at some point at a disadvantage if they want to cut us off, or So these questions, I would say they're not the same, but they intersect.
Which seems to suggest that the Biden Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually largely a build your industry up against the possibility of the Chinese dominating the Green Market Act, was quite a good move.
It was the beginning of a shift, and it did come from Biden's understanding of this vaguely of this kind of threat, that the U.S. needs to be economically independent of China in these few key industries. Yes, so it was one of the first shifts that began.
Hi, I'm Christina Lamb. I cover a lot of these bad places. I am. Thank you for a fascinating conversation. I wanted to ask you what you would say, places where the West has intervened to remove autocrats or dictators in recent years, so Iraq and Libya. Many of the people I meet there say things were better under those dictators because of the complete chaos that has followed. So what would you say to those people? The other question, which is sort of linked, is I get the impression if bad guys stay around long enough, that they then become normalized. And look at Assad, for example, in Syria, who's now being sort of welcomed back into international forum.
So first of all, my book is not an argument that we should remove dictators by force. I mean, I don't think that was successful. And actually, most of the people who were involved in democracy promotion, in the past, also never wanted that. So I'm not in favor of that. People who live in situations of chaos and strife and civil war, do usually want some single authority to come and replace. I mean, if you look at France after the French Revolution, I mean, it's not a surprising phenomenon. I mean, I actually think some of the forgive me for making this leap, but I mean, some of the attraction of autocratic thinking in the Europe and America comes from the fact that we live now at a moment of really rapid change, demographic, social, economic, political, in information and so on. And at moments when you have even that kind of, it's not even necessarily violent change, you have this long, I just want the cacophony to stop and I want to have one leader. And so that people would want that in Iraq doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, that seems understandable to me. What was the other question? It was about, oh, yeah, I mean, that was the purpose. I mean, the purpose of Putin intervening in the Syrian war was to keep Assad in power and to re-normalize him. And yes, he's recently, this might even be in my book, he was recently let back into the leaders of the Muslim world have invited him back into their various fora, having excluded him, and they've got used to the idea that he murdered a lot of people and created millions of refugees. But that was one of Putin's goals. He wants that kind of behavior to be normal. That it's okay, and he's doing it again in Ukraine. I mean, actually, one of the things I think is happening in Ukraine right now, the destruction of the power grid and of Ukrainian energy, part of the purpose of it might well be to create a new refugee wave, because Ukrainians are not going to be able to live in Ukrainian cities in the winter if there's no power and no heat and no water. And so he having successfully destabilized Europe with a wave of refugees in 2015, he's maybe doing it again. So yes, the purpose is to renormalize them.
Just an interesting wrinkle on that, Christina. You'll recall that in 2013, when Assad crossed Obama's red line with the chemical attack on Ghouta, the approximate reason why he didn't actually do anything was because the British government wouldn't support him. And the reason why the British government wouldn't support him is because the opposition voted against it, and some Tory MPs with them. In that autumn, I was on a coach trip with Douglas Alexander, who'd been was Shadow Foreign Secretary, and I asked him why Labour had taken that line and what he thought would happen. He said, "We think that Putin will help sort out the situation in Syria." And it's interesting the degree to which, I mean, that's for the want of a horseshoe nail argument, etc. But that's partly how that one played out. And the result was that non-intervention, you could argue, was catastrophic.
There's a question at the back. Hi, Anne, thank you. And thank you. It's always fascinating to hear you speak. I'd like to ask, if I may, what is your thinking about why some autocracies consider it important to retain a vestige of democracy? Why did the likes of Putin and Maduro bother with elections?
There are slightly different answers in those two cases. Maduro, according to my Venezuelan friends, held the election because he thought he was going to win. He didn't think he was going to lose. He was very arrogant and he believed his own opinion polls or whatever they were, and he thought he would win. In the case of Putin, Putin has used, and this is actually even before his regime became more extreme, and so over the last 25 years, Putin has consistently used kind of fake or managed, they call it managed democracy, as a way of enhancing his legitimacy. So there have been elections in Russia with kind of hand-picked opponents, who aren't the, real opponents go to jail, but there are these kind of created opponents who are allowed to compete. And there's been a kind of facade, rather, of democracy, and that's part of what he's used to maintain his legitimacy. So he actually takes the fact of elections very seriously. When he wins them, he celebrates, and that's part of his argument that he's the legitimate president of Russia. And that's actually true in a lot of regimes, that there is some element of fake or managed or controlled democracy that is meant to, it's also true that democracy is a very powerful idea. So even if we all hate it and we don't like our society and so on, and we are unhappy with the way it works, the idea that ordinary people should be able to have some influence over who their government is, they want to somehow steal the idea and use it for themselves. They don't want it to become a tool of the opposition, or a tool of their opponents. So it's actually quite common for dictatorships to organize elections. I mean, another version of that is of course there are elections in Hungary as well. It's just that Orban does what he can to, gerrymandering isn't quite the right word, but to change the way who's allowed to vote and who isn't, and control the voting count process, and of course the media is controlled in the run-up to the election, and people are given only one view of who should win, and so on. So there, he does various things to stay in charge, but he does have the elections. It's important to him to maintain them, and that's true in many. It's very common.
Also, the governments have the power to bribe electorates, fun enough, or set key sections of the elections as well, don't they?
Sometimes they even do it in healthy democracies.
They sometimes do. Please.
Should we regard it as significant or concerning that the long-term mentor of a very important group of British interests is now a full-time Orban employee?
I know this.
You know,
because this is one of my pet fascinations. No, we're talking about Frank Furedi, We're talking about Frank Furedi, who was the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party. When it split up, which was very, very radical, Baroness Fox was also a member of this, etc. They eventually became, via a major libel problem, they became spiked online. And he has now gone to Brussels as the head of the Orbanist MCC, Matthias Corvinus Collegium, to influence it. And essentially what, Peter, thank you very much for sharing my obsession, of which more somewhere else, Anne on. So if you'd like to share it too, Anne.
He's one, I mean, there are others. So one of the weird ones for me is John O'Sullivan, who was Mrs. Thatcher's speechwriter, has for many years run a think tank in Budapest called the Danube Institute, which functions as a, it's a kind of, I mean, it's a, you know, it's a way of inviting intellectuals to Budapest. You know, they'll give you a nice tour, you can stay there, you can meet nice people. It's a way of sort of soft promotion for the regime. That to me is the very weirdest of all those things. And there are others. There's another American called Rod Dreher who's gone there. So there have been a series of people who've been attracted to that regime for a long time, and some have their good reasons, maybe some have bad reasons. Actually, this was one of the themes of my previous book, not to do that annoying thing of saying read my previous book, but you know,
it's still available, and
people are legitimately, well, not well, legitimately. There are people who are attracted to Orban's idea. You know, he did something that was revolutionary. He was democratically elected. He took over the state. You know, he created a system in which he can't be displaced. He took over the media. He got rid of all those nasty critics. And
he's anti-Muslim.
And he's anti-Muslim, even though they don't have any Muslims there. And a lot of people find that idea attractive, and they would like to be able to do that in this country or in the United States. You know, so they admire him. You know, and I guess Frank is the revolutionary communist version, and John is the Thatcherite version.
Hey, thank you so much for the talk so far. I was just really interested in the way you portray a world that is split into these two camps between
There's not two camps.
Okay.
Many camps.
Okay, but there's a sort of fundamental dividing line.
There's a war of ideas.
Right, and there is autocracies on one side and democracies on the other.
Some, yes, and some others too.
Okay. Well, thank you for the real-time fact-checking. And it's relevant because I think this sense of there being a kind of a rule of law, a respect for human life, democratic principles in the kind of us side of that equation, and, you know, rule breaking and a lack of democracy on the other. I'm just curious as to how many countries that are in the constellation of us geopolitically, like Egypt, for example, like a brutal dictatorship, but that is a firm Western ally, or indeed its neighbor Israel that is, you know, is ostensibly a democracy but denies democratic rights to millions and is currently, you know, laying waste to civilian life. How does that fit into your kind of categorization?
You know, my argument is that we should fight. Not that, you know, this isn't it's not a Cold War. There aren't two sides. What we should be fighting are autocratic behaviors, including the ones here. And that's how I got to kleptocracy and money laundering and anonymous property purchases. And we should fight those things here, and we should fight them in other places. I mean, so it's not an argument for lining up one group of countries against another group of countries. And I also think there are a lot of countries that play both sides or have ambivalent or ambiguous roles. I mean, one of the more interesting examples, for example, is Vietnam. I was there a few years ago. Vietnam is a dictatorship. It's a communist, run by the Vietnamese Communist Party. Nevertheless, Vietnam is not seeking to undermine American politics. It is not trying to enhance extremism. It is not trying to overthrow the world order, whatever that means. You could call it a status quo power, whatever political science language you want to use, but it is not it's not really part of this network of countries that have malign intent. And of course, you could look at the Arab monarchies have ambiguous roles, including the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, but also Morocco and others. There are a lot of countries in between, and who do different things. So I'm not. This is not good guys versus bad guys. Sadly, because that would be much easier to explain.
Well, also it gives you it leaves out some kind of difficulties, because you could argue the same about Taliban-run Afghanistan, which is it doesn't particularly want to be on a side, but my goodness. Anyway, yes, the last question here, please.
Thank you.
You waited
guys,
the longest to ask.
I'm not sure about that, but it's a pleasure to see you again, and thank you very much both. I actually graduated from SAIS about 2 months before you joined, so really sad I didn't get to engage with you more. But my question is multi-pronged. I'll be as succinct as I can. Firstly, we talk about Putin, and a lot of rhetoric is about a post-Putinist Russia. The problem is that there are people who are even worse, like the late Vladimir Zhirinovsky and systemic opposition, right? So we can get rid of Putin, but unless there's an effective transition of power, like there is a opposition in Venezuela which is ready to take control, how do we ensure that it doesn't get worse? The better the devil you know. Equally, you mentioned about the statements that were given by Xi and Putin and that was including no limits partnership. That's since been removed. So how can we as the West undermine the strategical relationship between those two? And the last one is, you mentioned about the relationship of different kinds of countries that we have to pragmatically get on with. Isn't it just time for the West to be more transactional in its foreign policy instead of value-based?
That was cheating. Yes. That was 3 questions.
I know. It was quite a good cheat, though, because there were 3 pretty good questions.
Okay, so you can pick one. I slightly feel we're running out of time, so I'll try and be brief. Particularly the last one is a complicated question. In terms of Russian succession, Putin has created a system whereby it appears that there is no alternative. He has eliminated any system of succession. So it isn't just the question of we don't know who would follow him. We have no idea how that person would be chosen. So if he falls out of a window tonight, we don't know what process by which they'll choose the next leader.
Well, he will die. Even Putin will die.
Eventually, but that is a deliberate decision, and that's one of the things that's confusing about Russia. So it's not like Russians are given an alternative. You can have Putin or you can have this thing, and you can have a choice. They don't see any alternative, and they're deliberately deprived of an alternative because you're not meant to think about the alternative. This is it. You're stuck with this. In terms of who would come next and would they be better or worse, obviously I have no idea because I don't know by what process would choose this person. I mean, my instinct is at this point in time, there's really nobody worse than Putin because, first of all, whoever comes next, whoever he or she is, he most likely, he will have less legitimacy, he will have less security. He will immediately be the focus of all kinds of plots and conspiracy theories, probably. And I think that's good. So secondly, whoever comes next would at least find it easier to end the war. I'm not saying they will end the war, but they would find it more politically easier because it would not be their war that they started for their own egotistical reasons. So I'm highly in favor of leadership change, but that doesn't mean I'm carrying it out myself or that I know how to do it. So I don't know how to. I'm not advocating that we invade. Okay, it's not Christina's question. That's. And now I've forgotten what comes next.
I think actually that's fine. You can take up some of the rest. You admitted that you pulled a flanker there. And we do have to finish. So, you've got one more thing to say.
There's there are level. All diplomacy involves some dealing with people you didn't like, right? So I'm not saying we can have a pristine life in which we never talk to bad people. I mean, even real life involves dealing with people we don't like, right?
Don't look at me.
I was thinking of all the colleagues who you don't like, then, so I'm not. That's not what I'm arguing. But I am arguing that if we want to preserve our systems as, or make them resilient or make them continue, then we should be more aware of the people who are trying to undermine them, and that should be a part of our diplomacy, as in the case of, in our internal politics, not just about diplomacy, as in the case of the Biden administration, it already is beginning to be, So it's not an argument for not speaking to people. It's an argument for resilience, for thinking about it, for understanding what are the consequences of trade. I started out by talking about trade with dictatorships. Understand what the consequences are. Be aware of them. Don't pretend that there's some neutral world in which we're all just interested in money and nothing else matters, because that's not true.
Yeah, as ever, and it's in all your books, it's an argument for clear-sightedness above all. Before we thank Anne, can I just say from Anne and I to thank you very much for A, being here, and B, really brilliant questions.
Yep,
really,
those are good.
Really good questions. You've done yourselves proud. It won't earn you a free next year's membership, but it's you've done yourselves proud.
Thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it.
And my thanks from all of us to Anne for being here this evening. She'll be signing books at the back later.
No.
No.